Welcome to Fantasy Awash. Today we are doing the Finally Fall book tag, and I am joined by Johanna from Johanna Reads. Hi, Johanna. Thanks for joining me.
Hey Laura, thanks for having me. Anything by Janny Wirtz, really. And she most comes to mind because I just finished her third book in her Wars of Light and Shadow series. And there was a forest setting that was probably one of my favorite forest settings I've ever read in fantasy. But
Ooh.
because that's book three in a large series, I would
Yeah.
say if you're going to go into Janny Wirtz's books, maybe start with the standalone. And this is To Ride Hell's Chasm. And her nature descriptions, they just tend to be my favorite. She is a very gifted writer. She's very imaginative. She's also an artist. So she does all her own cover art. And you
Ooh,
could
good for
even
her.
see some of the setting cover art here in the back here. And I feel
Love
like
that.
she just brings it to life. You could tell she's an artist just by reading her books, though. They're so visually descriptive.
I love that. My answer to that question is definitely Yumi and the Nightmare Painter by Brandon Sanderson. It is secret project number 3. For people that aren't familiar with it, the story takes place with 2 protagonists essentially, and we are getting descriptions of each of their worlds, and you don't know how they are connected. And in one character's world, everything is powered by aquamarine and fuchsia lighting basically, and has this dark grimy descriptors with these like neon lights that kind of reads to me like it's out of the 1980s. And then from our other character Yumi, she lives in what I would almost consider to be almost medieval Japan, and the descriptors are beautiful. The artwork in this book is so beautiful. I loved it. Of the secret projects, I think it's probably the nicest art. So this for me was definitely setting wise the one that I'm going to think of for that question.
That's one I definitely want to read at some point. So I'm
I
glad to
loved
know.
it, and I have not read much Japanese or Asian inspired fantasy, so I was actually really excited to read that. Of course, I understand that Sanderson is a white writer and is writing Japanese style fantasy, but it was really, really beautiful, and honestly, the artwork is worth looking at the book alone. I just loved it.
Ah, I actually, now that you bring that up, I could bring up as another book that I would bring up for this category might be The Long Price Quartet of Shadow and
Mm.
Summer by Daniel Abraham. And so that's also Japanese inspired fantasy. And the way that
Oh,
he
nice.
describes the city of Sariket, the seaside city with the ships and with the different districts, with even just the way that the people orient themselves in the city, the bathhouses, the tea, everything
Mhm.
about those descriptions really come to life and make me feel like I'm in feudal Japan.
A heavy topic like loss or grief. Okay, so I haven't read this recently because I read it once and I will never read it again, but that was Flowers for Algernon for me.
Oh.
That was a really emotional read. I read it in high school and it has stuck with me since then. I couldn't tell you the author's name, honestly, just because the book left me so upset. That I tried to like put it out of my soul as soon as I finished reading it, but it has profoundly stuck with me. He is a person that is dealing with mental disabilities in that he's a bit slower, and they find a way to increase his intelligence, but he realizes that by the end of the book he's going to revert back to who he was at the beginning, and it's heartbreaking. So yeah, that was probably a big emotional one for me. How about
Yeah.
you?
Yeah, that's a really good one to choose, and one that I need to get to, but I'm going with Pet Cemetery by Stephen King. So this is one I
Ooh,
just recently read. I actually
yes.
listened to the audiobook of this with Michael C. Hall's narration. Michael C. Hall, the actor of Dexter, but this has to do with a
Yeah.
doctor, Dr. Lewis Creed. He and his wife Rachel, 2 kids, 2 small kids, and their cat, Church. They end up moving to Ludlow, Maine to start a new chapter of their life. He just got a job there. And they move to an old manor on a large plot of land that's on a street where these very big trucks drive a little too fast. And across the
Mhm.
street, there's an elderly couple where the man, Jude, tells them about a nearby pet cemetery in the woods right nearby. And so this whole book is about the supernatural power of a cemetery, but also it's it really goes deep into the theme of death and the theme of grief and the way that
Mm.
grief will totally change a person,
Yeah.
just bypass their rational mind and change their perception of time, the different stages of grief, but it's just captured in such a powerful way, but also with a horror supernatural story. So I thought this
Yeah.
was absolutely an incredible experience, perfect for spooky season too.
Oh, I love that. That's a great choice.
All right. So the nonfiction book I'm going to go with is one that I most recently read, and that is called Good Anxiety. And I believe the author is Wendy Suzuki. I will put it on the screen. We'll put it on the screen so I can make sure
Yeah.
that author's name is correct.
Mhm.
But this particular book, it actually didn't teach me a lot that I didn't know. But what I appreciated about it is she was talking about how all anxiety is not bad, and that's sort of the
Mhm.
problem with a lot of people who go to therapy these days. They pretty much demonize anxiety. And yes, we do have a large
Yeah.
instance of anxiety in our society today. And there can be unhealthy amounts of anxiety, unhealthy amounts of cortisol, but we do need some amount of anxiety in order to perform optimally. So she explains the science behind that from a neuroscience perspective. And so, what I really appreciated about the book is the way she addressed it from a neuroscience perspective, especially at the beginning of the book, talking about the executive function of the brain, the top down processing, and the bottom up processing, which is like the amygdala stress response. But what I really loved was the part where she talks about this concept called emotional regulation and how scientists used to think emotional regulation was all top down processing, all executive function, basically control your emotions, like use your
Mhm.
rational prefrontal cortex to just quell those emotions, quell that anxiety. And she said that nowadays neuroscientists are understanding that it's not so much top down as it is bidirectional. So it's more like
Mhm.
working with your anxiety, working with those emotions in order to have a more effective response through stressful situations. So I actually really appreciated that message again.
Yeah.
And it just kind of snapped into perspective a lot of different things. But I also just love the neuroscience perspective on that topic.
Yeah, that's awesome. I am actually gonna pick something that deals with therapy, so that's kind of funny.
Cool.
It's
Yay.
yeah, it's a book called Maybe You Should Talk to Somebody by Lori Gottlieb, and I loved this book. I am a lifelong therapy goer. I heavily believe in therapy. I feel like it's like getting a tune-up for you, like you would get a tune-up for your car. So, when I read this book, I loved how Lori Gottlieb is a therapist. She changed the name of her patients in the book, but she basically details how everyone goes through tumultuous periods in their life. And it's a story of how, even though we are different, we're all connected and we're the same in so many different ways, and how therapy can benefit people at different stages of their life to deal with different aspects of life. And I loved this because she didn't have kids as patients, but young adults up to like an 88-year-old that was coping with the fact that they didn't want to live anymore. And I just thought it was such a beautiful telling of people. And it really taught me more about how to approach therapy from a productive way, how therapy can be beneficial to not just yourself, but the people that you live with, your children, your parents, how it can improve relationships, your work life balance. Stress and anxiety was one of the things, but not demonizing anxiety and understanding that these different components of ourselves aren't necessarily bad. They're just part of the bigger picture and how we look at that bigger picture. So that would be my pick. I really enjoyed that book.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. I have heard of that book before. I'm trying to think if I heard about it on your channel, but it's
I
really,
don't think
really
so. I haven't
okay.
talked about it before, but it's definitely one that I say to people when they're interested in that kind of area. I'm like, "Oh, you should definitely look into that." Or, He does kind of the psychology of happiness, which is really interesting, and his name is Jonathan Haidt. So I'm like, if you're interested in those areas, those are the people that I'm gonna point you in their direction.
Oh, cool. Yeah, no, I
Yeah.
definitely have heard of that book before though, so it's wonderful to hear your endorsement of it.
Yes, definitely.
All right.
Oh, the Weasleys, 100%. There's no I don't have to think about that at all. It's the Weasleys. I love Molly and Arthur Weasley
Aw.
so much. All of their Christmas get-togethers sound exactly what I want. It's homemade sweaters, it's mince pies, it's like a great family meal. I love the Weasleys. I mean, and if I got to be a part of that family, I would maybe get really beautiful ginger hair. So there's like all these perks to being a part of that family. So yeah, I feel like I would go with the Weasleys.
Aw, that's a
How about you?
wonderful choice. I love that
Yeah,
choice.
I love the
Yeah,
Weasleys.
so the choice I'm going with is The Found Family in the Lions of Alrasan by Guy Gavriel Kay.
Great
Uh,
choice.
I know, because it was just so beautiful to spend time with this group of people who wouldn't normally intersect, but the way that they
Oh
intersected from
yeah.
different cultural backgrounds, different religions, different places in the world, but they're all older. So we have
Hmm.
like Rodrigo, Alvar, Jahan, however you say her name, and
Jahane, I
Amar.
think.
Jahane, probably,
Yeah.
yeah, and Amar, and just seeing how they intersect from different places, and the way
Hmm.
that they form connections over time, and it was beautiful because I feel like a lot of the found family I can think of that I've read before, most of them maybe involve younger protagonists, which is there's nothing wrong with that.
100%. Yeah, it's interesting you say that because as soon as you mentioned found family, I started thinking of, okay, like what are all the groups of found families? And I'm like, oh, okay, they're younger. But this is a great example of older characters doing that. I love that answer.
Yeah, I feel like Guy Gavriel Kay is so good at showing how we can form friendships as older adults and
Hmm.
seeing how that works. But yeah, this book is very evocative of medieval Spain. It's more like historical fantasy. And
Yeah,
Laura and I discussed it together. So if you want to hear
we
our
did.
thoughts, you can check out that video on my channel.
Yeah,
But
I'll
it's a
link it
fantastic
so
read.
you can find it.
We
Yeah,
both
it's
loved
such
it.
I love that book. I love that book so much. I think that that's honestly such a good choice. I didn't even think of non-conventional families, so that is such a good outside the box answer. I love it. Well done.
Thank you.
Um,
Thank you.
for number 5, we're gonna skip number 5 because it's basically showing you an autumnal book stack. I have a pumpkin right here. There you go. There's fall.
I
So
feel like your background already looks very autumnal, so
right?
that
And I
works
wore
anyway.
orange, you're in red, like, we're dressed autumnal, it works.
That
So we're gonna
works.
skip ahead to number 6.
Yeah. So my choice for this is one I just read, and I talked about it in my recent wrap up, and that's Caliban and Zour by Tad Williams. So this is a very early work by Tad Williams. I don't think it's a very well known work, and I kind
I
of joke
haven't
about
heard of it.
the cover looking like monster smut, but
Oh my gosh, yes, it
basically,
does.
I picked it up for like $3 in the bookstore. Everybody asks, "Where did you
I'm
pick
not
this
surprised with
up?"
that cover, honestly, not surprised.
It says here on the back, an eternity of love, an eternity of hate, a single hour to tell the tale. But this is actually based on the character Caliban. It's actually based on The Tempest by Shakespeare. So it takes
Excellent.
place many years later. Caliban, just to give some background about The Tempest, in The Tempest, we're on an island where former Duke of Milan, Prospero, who was usurped by his brother Antonio, is there with his daughter Miranda, who's this teenage girl, and they have a servant who is this servant named Caliban, who was born from a witch, and also a fae-like creature named Ariel, who does basically does Prospero's biddings because
Yep.
Prospero is a sorcerer. So actually, The Tempest is a fantasy story,
Oh,
but we
yeah.
don't get a lot of development with Caliban. He's there more as like comic relief, like a slapstick kind of comic relief character. And
Mhm.
I think that was why Williams decided to develop his character much more. So in this book, it's several years after the Tempest takes place. Miranda is married, her husband's never around, but she's there in the palace with her two children. She has a daughter who is coming of age, who's about to be married off, who doesn't want to get married, and a younger son. And when Miranda goes to bed, Caliban scales the walls and he comes to her bedroom and he says, "I'm gonna kill you, but first you're gonna hear my tale." And so he
Yeah.
basically gives his side of the story, what it was like for him to be born from his mother, to live off the island, to survive off the island, and
Wow.
then to what it was like to meet Miranda when he was a small child, and to meet
Yeah.
Prospero, how to, what he felt it was like to be civilized and to learn
Mhm.
their language and their ways. And also just how I think one of the big themes that comes out in this book is about love and hate, and how
Mhm.
it takes there you might think it takes a lot of effort to love someone, but it might take even more effort to hate someone, and that hate is fueled by love.
Yeah.
So it's a really I you know what? It's kind of cringe. I thought it was kind of cringy when I started it. I wasn't sure I was going to like it because I felt
Mhm.
like it was Tad Williams trying to go for a declamatory style of writing, kind of like trying to
Yeah.
sound Shakespearean, and I wasn't sure. But then I just despite myself, I found myself really sympathizing with this character and getting
Mhm.
totally immersed in the story. So I actually really enjoyed it.
Love that. You've also chosen 2 books back to back that have a character named Miranda, which I greatly like. So,
That's a good
yeah.
point. Yes.
Yeah. We only like books with Miranda characters, apparently.
It's true. I love that name too,
I
Miranda.
do too. I honestly think that that sounds like a really interesting book. I like when books can kind of take a play on something else and extrapolate upon it and build upon it. So I think that sounds really good.
Thank
But
you.
my
Let's hear it.
answer for that is also going to be a book that I just recently finished, and that is Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson. There is a character in the Stormlight Archive named Wit, and he likes to tell stories to particular characters. And in the first book of the Stormlight Archive, The Way of Kings, it was probably my favorite scene of the whole book was him telling a story. And in the second book, which is Words of Radiance, which is my answer here, it was really important, the story, and you didn't realize necessarily why in the moment it was important. Like, you knew it was going to come into importance later, but you didn't exactly know why. And I love the fact that you have a storyteller within the story who often annoys people, but you then realize that they're kind of this wise figure that's giving you these really convoluted fables. And I love that because I love fairy tales, I love fables. So any book that will kind of play upon that trope, I'm there for it. I really enjoy it. So yeah, I liked that a lot in Words of Radiance.
Ah, that's a great choice. I love that. That's perfect. It's been a
Yeah.
long time since I've read Words of Radiance, but I can remember. Yeah, I think that was really clever. I wouldn't have thought of that, but it's actually really well done. Well chosen.
Yeah, the story basically implies that this man is running a race and he knows he's gonna die, and he keeps pushing to finish the race even though he knows he's going to die. And I loved the symbolism of it, and it was executed so beautifully. I loved it. So, yeah, 10 out of 10 for that scene for me.
Wow. Excellent. That's great. Love it.
Ooh, I don't tend to read a lot of creepy books.
Me
So,
neither. I don't either.
I'm trying to think on that, honestly. I don't know how I would answer that. Okay, this is not your conventional answer for creepy. And if we're thinking of like Halloween type creepy or horror, I'm going to say Fire and Blood by George R. R. Martin. And the reason I'm going to say creepy for that is because there is a lot of incest, which people find creepy. But also, there are scenes of graphic depictions of what happened to people's bodies. That is a bit
Mm.
creepy. And there's mystery around that. So I actually really enjoyed the book because of that. There's one character in particular that she disappears for a period of time. And when she returns, it's just awful, what has happened to her physical appearance, and the description in the book is, like, chilling. So that was really creepy, but it was done in such an interesting and intriguing way because it's left this lingering mystery of what happened to her, and so I like that kind of creepy aspect to a book, but that would probably be my answer.
Oh,
How
that's
about
a
you?
great answer. No, I think Martin is talented when it comes to incorporating horror elements in his stories. I mean, I
Yeah.
could even think of examples of that in A Song of Ice and Fire, so
Oh,
that's a great
definitely, yeah.
answer. Yeah.
How
And I
about
still
you?
need to
What's
get
your
to Fire and Blood, so I'm glad you brought that up.
I think you'll like it, honestly. I mean, you love everything else, so I don't see why you wouldn't like
I know,
it.
when it comes to George R. R. Martin, I'm pretty much destined to love it, so
Yeah,
um,
exactly, it's
so I have
heartwarming.
a couple of choices. One is a book I just finished, and even though it didn't necessarily creep me out, I think that was its intention was to be kind of dark and haunting. So I'm just kind of going with that vibe. And the book is The Last Tale of the Bride. And
Oh, I've
actually,
heard of this
Laura,
book.
you
Mm.
might enjoy this one just because
Yeah.
it's all about the dark fairy tale and it incorporates
Yeah.
a lot of those influences in the story.
Mhm.
So this is actually about a man called the bridegroom, and he
Mhm.
falls in love with this mysterious woman named Indigo. And
Yep.
Indigo has a he's actually a scholar of fairy tale, and he falls in love with her in like what is a whirlwind romance, and she agrees to be with him forever as
But he
long
can't
as he
ask about her
never
past, right?
pries. Yes, as long as he never
Yeah.
pries into her past. And so it's
Yeah.
dealing with a lot of elements of fairy tale, like oaths, and for example, it kind of goes meta a little bit here and there when it comes to that,
Mm.
especially from his perspective.
Yeah.
And I would say it's very dreamlike, the way it's written. It feels
Ooh,
very dreamlike. You're
okay.
also getting another perspective of a friend of hers that she knew in her past. So you're kind of trying to fill in the gaps and the details of what actually is the story behind this woman, this mysterious woman that
Oh,
we're
I
not
like
supposed to
that.
understand. And so, yeah, it's really kind of drawing upon the influence of the dark gothic fairy tale. So I think that
Mhm.
that would be my choice for that answer. Another
That's a
one
great
that
choice.
might be another one, that I just pulled off my shelf, could be Knight of Knives by Ian C. Esselmont. So this is a novel of the Malazan Empire. I'm sometimes hesitant to bring this up as a recommendation because some people would say that you have to read or there's an order to read the Malazan books, and this would come between, I think, books 5 and 6, if I'm not mistaken, in the
Mhm.
series, but I think you could totally read this out of order and just read it as a standalone and be fine, and I think the authors have both said that too, that you don't have to
Yeah.
read the standalones in any specific order, but this particular one deals with what is called a, let's see, what is the night called? This sort of like dark shadow moon, the shadow moon night, um, that where it's this one night where there's this huge convergence and you see all these different apparitions and these hounds of shadow that are kind of
Oh,
taking place on
cool.
Malaz Island. And it's much more contained than the other Malazan stories. And we also follow two POVs. One is a young girl named Kiska who just wants to be out where the action is. She wants to get off the island, to do things, be adventurous. And then the other perspective is an old grizzled veteran named Temper. So he's the opposite.
Ooh,
He wants to retire. He wants to be
yeah,
done with his military life and just settle down. And all this chaos ensues. So I would say this does give me dark Halloween vibes, and
for
it would be a
sure.
good one to get into the Malazan world.
I
Yeah.
love that. That's a great 2 choices. I have seen the first book, that you had, so I you've piqued my interest because I have looked at it a few times and I'm like, "Oh, maybe I would like it," but now with your recommendation, maybe I'll
Yeah,
move
I'll
it
be
to further
honest,
up my
like,
list.
I really appreciated it, I enjoyed it. It didn't necessarily hit strong emotional highs for me, but it was
Mhm.
one that I thought was beautifully crafted, and I appreciated the different influences in it, and I'm sure with you and your knowledge of fairy tale would find little nuggets and seeds throughout that you would appreciate too.
I love that, so I'm gonna have to look into it.
So this is the hardest one for me because I just don't read short,
Short books?
heartwarming reads.
Yeah, I
The
know.
only thing and this is I feel like this is the most generic answer, I'm sorry, but Legends and Lattes, like, that's the easy answer.
It's a great answer,
It's a
though.
great book though, and it did warm my heart, honestly, and
Yeah,
it's a short read. You could probably most people could probably read it in a sitting,
yeah,
but this one deals with an orc named Viv who is done with her mercenary life as a warrior, and she puts her sword up on the shelf and decides to settle down in a town and build a coffee shop, and this is
yeah.
kind of a fantasy town where they really don't know about this magical dark bean drink. And it goes into a lot of food descriptions. But it's also, even though this is not lit RPG, it feels like there's a progression in the story as she's putting together this coffee shop, as she's gathering friends to help her along the way to make this dream become a reality and to add innovations to the shop. And and you really see what it's like and the vulnerability she experiences in starting
Mhm.
this new chapter of her life and opening up to new friends. So again, you have a little bit of adult friendships that are being formed in the story that I enjoyed, but also just cute, fun fantasy characters. It's just a very lighthearted, warm read.
It's so inclusive too, which I love about that book. It's super inclusivity positive. So yeah,
That's a
Legends and
really good
Lattes,
point.
great. My answer for that is going to be Nancy Boys by Neil Gaiman. A lot of people think of it as a sequel to American Gods. It doesn't have to be. You can read it on its own. It's not a very long book. I think it hits all the right notes of humor. So for me, if you like satirical humor or slightly dark humor, this is one that had me laughing out loud on the train and people looking at me like I was a lunatic when I was heading to school. I absolutely love this book. The basic premise is that the main character is a man named Charlie. His father was a deity named Anansi who has died. And he goes to Florida to settle the estate of his father. And he's told while he's there that he has a brother. And he's never heard of this brother before, anything like that. And the women that are with him that are helping him settle up the estate basically say, if you ever want to talk to your brother, just tell a spider. And he flies back home, gets really drunk to kind of cope with his father's passing, and sees this little spider on the balcony. And he basically says, like, tell my brother I say hi. And the next day, this guy shows up who's his brother, and all chaos ensues. And it's so funny. I just loved it. Everything about it from start to finish, I enjoyed. I loved that Neil Gaiman introduced me to a different deity, being a Nancy of African descent, and opened my eyes to that tradition. Loved it. Love, love, love. I love a Nancy Boys. Highly recommend. It's just a mood booster for me. So I think other people might like it too.
It's a really good choice. And I never hear about that book enough when I hear about Neil Gaiman.
I
So
know. And I always feel like people forget about it a lot of the time. And I feel like over the last few years in particular, Coraline is pretty much like a resounding favorite for a lot of people. And American Gods is my favorite. But the last couple years, Ocean at the End of the Lane has really taken
good
off for
one.
a lot of people. So, which is great because it's an excellent book. And I find that the Norse mythology book are that and Ocean at the End of the Lane are probably the two books other than American Gods most recently that get discussed. So I'm hoping maybe that if people will delve into the Neil Gaiman catalog, I'm like, there's so many gems in there, and Anansi Boys is one of them. So I hope that more people start talking about it because it's a great, great choice.
That is a great choice. I do have another honorable mention for this category, and that is The Vanished Birds by
Mm.
Simon Jimenez. And I read this thanks to Evie from She Was Only Evie, who gifted me this copy. This is a space opera, and we're dealing with this mysterious child and who intersects with this woman who is a pilot. This pilot who she does a lot of travel through space, and as a result of that, she's traveling through light years in a sense that like she can't really build connections with people very easily because so much
Mhm.
time goes by between years when she's traveling. So what
Yeah.
might be a couple years for her might be like a few decades for another person. So
Ooh.
it's a challenging job she has, and yet she finds this connection with this boy and this young boy who is basically mute, but he communicates through a flute. And then there's a whole other larger plot line with what's happening with Earth and space and how important this boy is to the fate of things that are happening. And so it kind of deals with I would say things falling apart and coming together, I think, on a large scale, on a macro scale, and on a on a minor scale too, on a
Mhm.
micro scale, I should say. But it was actually very touching and heartwarming, and one of the
Yeah.
things I appreciated about it was, like, the structure, because you open up the book and you feel like this is about one kind of story, and it kind of flips it around, and it turns into something else,
Yeah,
And plus, Jimenez's prose is what I would consider modern, but still it has this like it's beautiful too. It's modern,
yeah.
but it's lyrical.
Accessible.
Mhm.
Love
It's
that.
a really lovely
A great
book.
choice.
Yeah.
Of Ice and Fire. Definitely A Song of Ice and Fire. I haven't reread it in a decade, over a
Yes.
decade, so it's due. Joanna and I have talked about this. I tried listening to the audiobook, and it didn't work for me. So I'm hoping in the new year to sit back down and reacquaint myself with that world just because it's been a really long time. And also having read Fire and Blood this year, I'm like I it's not the same time period, right? But it's the same universe, so it's nice to kind of have that connection. So that kind of has sparked my wanting to get back to it. And also seeing all of you guys have your chats about all these books again, I'm like, "Oh yeah, this would be nice to get back into." So, A Song of Ice and Fire. How about you?
Yeah, Laura and I need to flip, by the way, because I just finished my reread of A Song of Ice and Fire, and now I need to read Fire and Blood. So
Yeah.
I kind of need to switch places with
Exactly.
you about that. And Duncan Egg, the seven nights. I cannot remember the
Night of
name
the
of that
Seven
one.
Kingdoms.
Thank you, that one.
Yeah,
So
it's a
I kind of
great
laughed. I laughed when I saw this question because I was thinking I need to stop rereading books because I have reread so many books this year, and I didn't even intend this to be a big reread year by any means. I knew I was gonna be rereading A Song of Ice and Fire, which I also read the first time around the same time as Laura, but, I've just been spending so much time rereading books that I'm like, "I need to quit," but there is one I do wanna reread at some point, I'm not sure when, I'm not in any hurry to do so, but hold on one second. I actually have a special edition of this one, and that is The Never Ending Story by Michael Ende, translated from
Oh,
German to English.
mhm.
This is my special edition copy. This
Wow.
is my probably my favorite portal fantasy because it's
Really?
about yeah, I love it. So this one, I grew up just a little bit of backstory. I grew up with the movie The Never Ending Story, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and I still
I
love
still
that
have
movie.
nightmares of that movie.
It is really yeah, it's pretty
Yeah,
scary at times,
yeah.
for sure, and, but after having watched the movie, it wasn't until I was a teenager that a friend of mine approached me and lent me the book, and I had no idea that the movie is based on the book, and
Mhm.
then when I read the book, I was completely blown away, 1, how good the book was, but 2, that the movie actually ends halfway through the book, and that there's a
Oh,
lot
really?
more story yeah. Halfway
Oh,
through.
wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, around halfway through, and, I really love the way that the rest of the story goes. So if you wanna know, this is
Awesome.
about a young boy who he ends up bullied at school. He has a rough relationship with his father. He's a little different. He's described a little bit differently than the movie.
Yeah.
He's described as a bit chubby, so he's a little bit awkward in his body and in his life. He's struggling with life. He goes into a bookstore. He ends up stealing a book called The Neverending Story, and he goes to school that day, but he doesn't end up going to class. He ends up going away, hiding out in the attic area, I think. It's hard to I hope I'm not, uh confusing the movie too much because I did watch the movie since I read it again, and I
Okay.
sometimes confuse the 2 things, but he does hide away at the school to read the Neverending Story, and then
Mm,
when he reads the Neverending Story, he gets swept away by what's happening in the Neverending Story, this wonderful fantasy story, and the next thing he knows, he realizes he's a key player in this story. So,
mm,
it's a book within a book, and it's also it's a framed narrative, and
yeah.
it's also just so imaginative. I love the descriptions, the world building, the creatures, but there's also a lot of metaphor in the story. I think there's a lot that even
Mm,
adult readers can enjoy. So this is one that I actually have read twice. Last time I read it or reread it, I then watched the movie. I still think the movie is a fantastic adaptation, even though Michael Ende, the author, apparently wasn't happy with the way they ended the movie
why?
because it is so different than the book. But I still love both, but I would say if you are a fan of the movie, do yourself a favor and read the book because it is so, so good.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
As a side note, the scene with the horse in that movie, like,
traumatizing.
traumatized me as a child. It
Mhm.
still does as an adult.
It is
Anytime
absolutely
you see one of
traumatizing.
those, like yeah, anytime I see one of those polls that they're like, "Name a scene that changed you as, like, a kid," and I'm like, "It's always that scene." I was crying. I then had nightmares about, like, quicksand for, like, months. I was saying to my husband the other day, I was like, quicksand was like this weird fear when I was a child, and there's no justification for it because it's not like I was ever exposed to it. And I think it stemmed from the never ending story. Uh,
Yeah,
Even though it's
and,
more mud,
yeah, it's
but
mud, and I think it's mud, and then, actually, but there is quicksand in The Princess Bride,
there
so I wonder
is,
if that
yes.
movie but just the idea of sinking down into the earth I actually have nightmares about that
No.
too. It's funny.
I know, right? Like, it's so terrifying. I'm like, "Oh my gosh." And yeah, I don't know why. That was probably my biggest fear as a kid was just like getting sucked into the earth. It had zero justification, but there you are. The weird things that stick with you. But I would be interested in watching that possibly as an adult. I don't know though, like if I could go back to it, I would probably have to skip that scene just because like anything with animals, I'm like, so yeah.
Yeah, it's so good. I love the movie still, like I said. It still brings up a lot of nostalgia for me, but I
Mhm.
think that the book is so good too. It's so complimentary, and again, it takes a direction you wouldn't expect
Yeah.
after where the movie ends. So I really appreciated what I
That's
Enda
cool
did.
because you basically get a whole new story, right?
Kind of,
So that's
yeah, or it's a
exciting.
continuation of the same one, but
Right, but I
it
mean,
does
whole new in the sense that it's a whole new portion of the story to you. So it's like a part 2. So that's really exciting.
this one. What is yours, Laura? Do you know? Because I guess I could say for me, I don't really have cozy reading accessories only because I tend to read when I'm walking on my treadmill in the morning or when I'm on my
Good for
stationary bike.
you.
Well, I do that because of my back, because if I sit too long reading, I have a lot of neck and back and shoulder
Yep,
tension. I tend to roll forward too much, so I have to work on that. So my
I hear
cozy
you.
reading accessory isn't really a cozy one. It's like if I'm gonna sit down, then I get my elastic band, which is over there, and I try to do some like chest opening exercises to get my shoulders back. But I do have like a little thing I just bought, and I don't have it with me. I'm sorry, but it's like a little stand to hold up my book. So then, if I'm like eating a meal or something and I want to read while I'm eating, then I could put a book up on the stand to read. That's about it.
Oh, that's a good choice. Mine's a blanket.
Oh, nice.
I pretty much will always have a blanket on my lap unless it's a million degrees outside in the summer, in which case I've got my cat on my lap and I'm still overheated. So generally it's either my cat and blanket or just the cat. But yeah, that would probably be my little cozy accessory. I'm pretty basic with that stuff, honestly. I've just usually got my book, my glasses, and sometimes a cup of tea. So maybe that's my cozy accessories, but
Sounds
mostly
cozy.
my cat.
Nice.
uh, yeah, I love that.
That the cat
Well,
works. That's a really good cozy
I
accessory.
mean, I think he's pretty cozy. My kid seems to think so too, because now her new favorite thing is whenever he's on my lap, she comes over and like drapes herself on him, which
Hmm.
he's not super into, but we're getting better. So, because we're still at that phase that she doesn't really understand gentle as a concept. So, which is funny because sometimes she'll lean on him and she's like so gentle and she goes, and this takes like 3 minutes to like fully put her head down. And then other times it's like a full on tackle of love. So,
Aw.
he just doesn't know what to expect and doesn't like the surprise. But yeah, my cat would be my cozy accessory. Does your cat cuddle with you at all when you read? Is he a cuddler or
He is a cuddler. He mostly cuddles on my husband when he's watching shows. He has a little
yeah?
spot that he gets on my husband's lap, and he just curls up and goes to sleep. And he likes to be nearby, but because like I said, most of the time when I'm reading, I do sometimes read in bed, not a lot, but most of the time, yeah, I'm just moving when I read because it helps me to think
Yeah.
and it helps me to make sure my back doesn't get stagnant and tight.
I'm so impressed. If I'm not like in silence and still, I can't absorb what I'm reading. It's really
Mhm.
difficult for me. I was that person when studying or whatever, I was like silence. So I was in the quiet room in the library at home. If my kid is awake, chances are I can't read because I get distracted unless it's an audiobook, which is meant to be obviously
Mm.
like listened to.
Yeah.
So that's a bit different for me. But if I'm actually sitting down with print, I'm like, I need quiet. And yeah.
Well, while on my treadmill, I usually wear my, like, noise canceling earbuds, and so
Mhm.
it doesn't totally mute out all of the sound, all the outside sound, but it helps a little bit. But usually it just turns into white noise, and then I could just
Yeah.
kinda zone in on the story. Yeah.
I'm just so impressed you can be moving and reading. Like, that to me is so impressive. I'm like, I would be so distracted by everything happening. So, commend you immensely.
Well, I mean, after a while, you just don't think about it. You're kinda just
I'm sure.
walking and I don't know. It's a lot
In the
easier with
zone.
ebooks, though, I will be honest about that. Sometimes with
I'm sure.
paperbacks, it takes a lot of spine
Yeah.
maneuvering.
100%. Well, thanks for joining me for the Finally Fall book tag. We'll have to reconvene next year and see how our choices have changed. If you are watching this, you can let us know in the comments down below what your answers were to the questions, and you can find Joanna's info in the description. Do you want to plug your channel in case someone doesn't know what your channel is?
Sure, my channel's name is Joanna or Joanna_reads, and I just talk about the books I read, basically, which usually tends to be fantasy, but I branch out now and then to other genres, and I'd love to have you stop by.
Thanks, everybody. Hope to see you next time.